There is a pattern in history so consistent, so brutally repetitive, that once you recognize it, you can look at any global power and predict with disturbing accuracy where it stands, how far it has left, and what comes next. This pattern is not a theory. It is a sequence proven across empires separated by centuries. Spain in the 1500s, Britain in the 1800s, the Soviet Union in the late 1900s. Three giants that genuinely believed they were too strong, too wealthy, too powerful to ever collapse, and all three of them fell anyway. They collapsed not because of foreign enemies, but because the internal math of empire caught up to them. Today, in 2025, the United States is deep inside that same cycle, following it stage by stage with almost eerie precision, as if the script was carved into stone long before America even existed. And just like every empire before it, the United States believes it is the exception, the outlier, the one nation that can break the cycle. But history has never granted an exception, not once. A falling empire does not look like collapse in its early stages. That is one of the most deceptive parts of the pattern. When decline begins, everything still looks functional on the surface. The currency still works. Stores are full. The military is still powerful. Elections still happen. Institutions still appear intact. The people still believe in the system, or at least pretend to. Life feels stable enough that no one realizes they are living in the early chapters of a collapse until the collapse is already accelerating. The cracks start quietly. Productivity slows. Wealth concentrates. Institutions lose credibility. Corruption rises in ways normalized by the public. Debt grows faster than economic output. Investments stop flowing into long-term development and instead into political distractions or military commitments. Fragmentation happens silently at first. The belief that the nation can self-correct begins to weaken. People feel the decline years before they can articulate it. Empire collapse builds like pressure behind a dam, slow, steady, invisible, until the final stages hit suddenly and everything breaks at once. Spain was the first major empire to demonstrate this full pattern. In the late 1500s, Spain stood alone at the top of the world. After conquering vast civilizations in the Americas and absorbing their gold and silver mines, Spain controlled more wealth than any European power had ever touched. Treasure fleets carried back staggering amounts of silver, hundreds of metric tons every decade, giving Spain the closest thing the world had ever seen to a global reserve currency. Spanish silver coins circulated across continents. Merchants and governments treated them as the backbone of international trade, and with this wealth, Spain built a military machine that stretched across 4 continents. Spanish ships, soldiers, and administrators formed a network of dominance unmatched in scope. But the same thing that gave Spain its power also planted the seeds of its destruction. Wealth made Spain overconfident. It convinced leaders that the flow of silver would last forever. They assumed the world would always need their currency, always accept their dominance, always treat Spain as the center of power. And that is when the stages of collapse began. First came military overreach. Spain fought everywhere. North Africa, Italy, France, the Netherlands, the Mediterranean, the Atlantic, and the Pacific. An empire spread across such vast distances must spend endlessly to maintain control. But no matter how much silver arrived, the expenses grew even faster. Then Spain weakened its currency, diluting silver with copper to stretch its wealth further. Inflation surged. Merchants rejected official valuations. Trust in Spanish money deteriorated. Next came the debt trap. Spain borrowed aggressively, defaulted, restructured, borrowed again, and defaulted again. 4 sovereign bankruptcies in a single generation. That level of financial instability shattered confidence at home and abroad. And the final stage was the collapse of domestic productivity. Because Spain relied so heavily on imported wealth, its own industries shriveled, skills vanished, innovation died. Spaniards imported goods instead of producing them, believing they were too rich to fail. When silver weakened, Spain discovered it had hollowed out its economy, and by then the damage was irreversible. Britain repeated the same pattern almost step for step, simply on a different timeline. At its peak, the British Empire controlled a quarter of the planet's population. The pound sterling was the world's reserve currency. British naval power shaped global trade routes. London served as the financial center of the world. Britain enjoyed dominance that felt permanent. But empires always faced the same trap, maintaining global control drains resources faster than any economy can replenish them. Britain's military obligations were immense. Colonies spanned multiple continents and required constant funding. Then came World War I, a conflict Britain entered not because it was profitable, but because refusing to fight meant losing global influence. Britain won the war on the battlefield but lost it economically. The cost of conflict forced Britain into massive debt. Its gold reserves drained, its currency weakened, its industries struggled to compete. By the end of World War II, Britain was no longer a creditor nation. It was deeply indebted, weakened, and forced to withdraw from its empire. One colony after another broke away. The pound fell from global dominance. Just like Spain, Britain assumed its power was permanent. Just like Spain, it discovered the bill for empire always arrives, and it is always too large to pay. The Soviet Union collapsed even faster, proving that the timeline of empire decline accelerates with technology. The USSR appeared solid from the outside. Nuclear arsenal, vast landmass, global ideology, military strength comparable to the United States. But beneath the surface, the economic structure was brittle. Central planning suppressed innovation. Consumer goods were scarce. Productivity lagged far behind the West. And the military consumed enormous resources. When oil prices dropped in the 1980s, the Soviet economy imploded almost overnight because it depended heavily on oil exports. Without that revenue, the government couldn't sustain the system. Shortages worsened. Nationalist movements surged. The ruble collapsed in credibility. In less than 3 years, from apparent stability to total disintegration, the USSR fell apart. No foreign invasion, no catastrophic war, just financial collapse triggering political collapse. Spain fell. Britain fell. The Soviet Union fell. And now the United States is following their steps with almost mathematical precision. The United States today sits in the center of the same pattern that consumed Spain, Britain, and the Soviet Union. But unlike those empires, America's collapse will not take a century like Spain's, nor decades like Britain's, nor even a few years like the USSR. It will happen faster because the world now moves faster. Information moves instantly. Capital moves instantly. Confidence disappears instantly. And in an empire whose dominance depends on financial trust, once confidence cracks, the fall is immediate. To understand where America stands, we must map the stages of collapse onto the U.S. itself. And when we do, the alignment is unmistakable. The first stage is military overreach. The United States maintains the most extensive global military presence in human history. Depending on how one counts, it operates more than 700 installations overseas and maintains a troop footprint in over 140 countries. Aircraft carrier groups patrol every major ocean. Security guarantees spread across Europe, Asia, the Middle East, and beyond. Alliances require constant funding, constant deployments, and constant military readiness. For decades, this system worked because America could afford it. But global dominance always becomes a financial burden that grows faster than the empire's economy. When a nation commits to defending the world, it inevitably spends more than it can sustain. Like Spain with its conquests or Britain with its navy, America has reached the point where commitments outweigh resources. The belief that military presence equals security blinds leaders to the financial reality. Maintaining such a footprint is mathematically impossible in the long run. And while Americans argue about politics, social issues, and cultural battles, the military budget grows larger than the next 10 nations combined, draining the economy quietly and relentlessly. The next stage is currency debasement. Every empire that overspends turns to the same tool, printing money or diluting its currency. Spain mixed copper into silver. Britain abandoned gold convertibility. The Soviet Union printed rubles no one wanted, and America prints dollars. Since the early 1970s, the U.S. dollar has lost more than 95% of its purchasing power. The last few years accelerated that trend. Trillions of dollars were created in a short period. The money supply expanded at rates that would have been unthinkable in previous decades. That expansion may appear abstract to most people, but its effects are concrete. Rising prices, declining real wages, widening inequality, collapsing purchasing power, and decreasing global confidence in the dollar. The United States has relied on its status as the world's reserve currency to hide the consequences of these actions. But reserve currency status is not a shield. It is a privilege, and privileges once lost do not return. Then comes the debt spiral. The United States carries more than $30 trillion of national debt, a figure that grows faster each year. Interest payments alone are swallowing a massive portion of government revenue. When a nation must borrow money simply to make interest payments on its existing debt, it is no longer managing an economy. It is managing a countdown. Spain defaulted multiple times when debt overwhelmed its finances. Britain devalued its currency repeatedly for the same reason. The Soviet Union collapsed because its economic structure could no longer sustain its obligations. The United States continues to refinance endlessly, borrowing at every opportunity, extending liabilities further into the future, in the hope that tomorrow will somehow be more manageable. But mathematics does not care about hope. Compounding debt accelerates. Once interest becomes the dominant expense, the rest of the system begins to suffocate. Infrastructure decays, social programs weaken, investment evaporates. The government becomes desperate for revenue and begins hunting for it anywhere it can, squeezing citizens through taxes, fees, and inflation. This is the point at which the public begins to feel the collapse personally. Stage 4 is the loss of productive capacity. America once manufactured everything from steel to electronics to pharmaceuticals. Today, the country depends on global supply chains for critical goods, from microchips to antibiotics to basic machinery. When a nation stops producing, it stops controlling its destiny. This mirrors Spain's decline, when silver made work unnecessary and imports replaced domestic production. America outsourced manufacturing for decades, under the illusion that innovation and finance alone could sustain its economy. But wealth built solely on consumption is fragile. When supply chains break, when foreign nations become rivals instead of partners, America finds itself exposed. A service economy may generate profit during stability, but it collapses during crisis because it cannot feed itself, clothe itself, or supply itself without external help. No superpower in history has survived long once it loses control of its industrial base. None. Stage 5 is internal fragmentation. Every empire that collapses falls apart inside before it falls apart outside. Spain struggled with a rigid class structure and religious power battles. Britain fractured under the weight of colonial resistance and social disparity. The Soviet Union crumbled because its ideological foundation no longer unified the republics. The United States today is undergoing its own internal breaking. Political polarization has reached levels unseen in modern American history. Trust in government, media, and institutions is at record lows. Social cohesion is eroding. Cities face addiction epidemics. Rural regions face economic decline. Urban centers face homelessness crises. Families face shrinking incomes, rising costs, and cultural instability. These are not isolated problems. They are interconnected symptoms of a system that no longer produces optimism. When citizens believe their nation is heading in a negative direction, when they lose faith that the system can correct itself, when they operate as separate tribes rather than a unified people, collapse becomes not just possible, but inevitable. No empire survives once its population stops believing in the legitimacy of its institutions. Stage 6 is the erosion of reserve currency status. This is the moment that differentiates a powerful nation from a fallen empire. As long as the world trusts a currency, that nation can borrow endlessly, print freely, and maintain influence globally. But when trust fades, the empire has no tools left. The US dollar dominated global finance for decades, but that dominance is eroding. Countries now settle trade in local currencies. Nations diversify their reserves into gold, alternative assets, or other currencies. Alliances form specifically to bypass the dollar. Global debt markets prepare for a multipolar currency landscape. These developments may seem gradual, but once a reserve currency loses its privileged status, the collapse accelerates with shocking speed. Spain's silver dominance faded once merchants no longer trusted Spanish coins. Britain's pound collapsed as trade partners moved toward the dollar. A similar shift is occurring now, and once it passes a tipping point, the correction will not be reversible. Stage 7 is the rapid phase of collapse. This is when everything that once felt permanent vanishes quickly. For Spain, it took a century because the world moved slowly. For Britain, it took decades because the world moved faster. For the Soviet Union, it took less than 3 years because the world had become interconnected. For the United States, living in a hyper-accelerated global system, collapse will move even faster. It will appear sudden, even if the warning signs were present for decades. Markets will panic. Debt markets will freeze. Currency value will drop violently. Political chaos will erupt. Military commitments will become unaffordable. Allies will distance themselves. And the American public, conditioned to believe collapse is impossible, will be blindsided. The United States has already passed multiple irreversible thresholds in this cycle. It has overspent, overextended, overprinted, and overpromised. It has weakened its productive base, fractured internally, and begun to lose global trust. And like every empire before it, America believes it is unique, special, above history. Spain believed that. Britain believed that. The Soviet Union believed that. Every empire throughout time believed that. And every empire was wrong. What makes the American situation even more precarious than the empires that came before is the speed and interconnectedness of the modern world. Spain collapsed in slow motion because information traveled by ship, because markets evolved over decades, and because regional economies were insulated from one another. Britain collapsed faster because global finance moved at the pace of telegraphs, cables, and emerging markets. The Soviet Union collapsed faster still because television, rapid trade flows, and oil shocks transmitted instability instantly. But the United States exists in a world where destabilization travels at the speed of light. Capital leaves markets in seconds, not years. Social unrest can ignite nationwide in minutes. Confidence in institutions can evaporate in a single news cycle. Supply chains stretch across continents and break with a single conflict. And because America has tied its identity, its economy, and its global position to the dollar, the military, and the financial system, any shock to those pillars reverberates across every layer of society. The collapse of an empire in the modern age will not be a slow fading. It will be a chain reaction. When the dollar's credibility breaks, borrowing costs will skyrocket. When borrowing costs skyrocket, debt becomes unpayable. When debt becomes unpayable, the government cannot fund basic functions. When basic functions fail, political legitimacy collapses. And when political legitimacy collapses, the social fabric tears. We have seen hints of this pattern already in moments of crisis. Sudden political polarization, riots sparked within hours, banking scares triggered by rumors, social media amplifying panic, markets swinging violently on expectations rather than fundamentals. These are previews of what happens when a system under pressure encounters a point of failure. Once the momentum begins, no government has the tools to stop it. All it can do is slow the speed of the fall. Every empire also reaches a psychological point of no return, a moment when the population stops believing in tomorrow. Spain experienced it when silver shipments could no longer mask economic weakness. Britain experienced it when its colonies began demanding independence, and the public quietly accepted that the empire was finished. The Soviet Union experienced it when its citizens realized the state could not provide basic goods. For America, this psychological turning point may already be taking shape. Younger generations believe they will be poorer than their parents. Housing is unaffordable for millions. Life expectancy has stagnated or fallen. People openly talk about decline as if it is normal. Both sides of the political spectrum treat the other as existential enemies rather than fellow citizens. Trust in institutions is near historic lows. When the belief in a shared future disappears, collapse becomes a matter of timing, not possibility. The United States also faces a geopolitical environment unlike anything previous empires encountered. Spain competed with emerging European powers but controlled most global silver. Britain competed with rivals but maintained naval supremacy. The Soviet Union competed with the United States but existed within a bipolar world. America, however, faces a multipolar world where several rising powers, China, India, regional blocs, and alliances, are increasingly capable of forming their own systems outside of American influence. This competition is not built on ideology. It is built on economic opportunity, strategic independence, and distrust of U.S. intervention. As more countries participate in alternative financial systems and non-dollar trade agreements, the U.S. loses the single advantage that allowed it to overspend for decades, the ability to print the world's reserve currency without consequence. When countries stop needing dollars, America's debts stop being invisible. They become a burden that must be paid in real terms, not inflated away. Economic decline also accelerates social fracture. When living standards stagnate, people seek someone to blame. Immigrants, political leaders, corporations, foreign countries, rival ideologies, anyone except the mathematical reality that debt, deindustrialization, and political dysfunction have eroded the foundation of national prosperity. This blame becomes weaponized by politicians, amplified by media, and spread through social networks until the society becomes so polarized that cooperation becomes impossible. No empire has ever survived this stage. When citizens no longer share a common identity, a common faith in institutions, or a common vision of the future, internal conflict replaces unity. And once a nation begins fighting itself, politically, culturally, economically, its collapse accelerates exponentially. When the collapse phase begins in earnest, it won't be signaled by a single event. It will be a series of shocks that compound. A banking crisis here, a debt ceiling crisis there, a geopolitical conflict that stretches military resources, a currency decline that raises import costs, a political scandal that breaks public trust, a government shutdown, a recession, a market crash. Each event by itself is survivable. Combined, they create a downward spiral. This is how empires die, not with a single blow, but with repeated hits that eventually break the structure. The final collapse looks sudden, but its roots grow unnoticed for decades. And when the moment arrives, it will feel oddly familiar because it mirrors every collapse before it. The public will be told that everything is under control. Officials will insist that the crisis is temporary. Analysts will talk about rebounds and recoveries. Politicians will blame each other. But beneath these surface-level reassurances, the system will continue to fracture. Banks will tighten lending. Investors will flee to safer assets. Foreign governments will distance themselves. Markets will move erratically. The population will sense that something is fundamentally wrong, even if they cannot define it. This psychological shift, when confidence disappears and fear takes its place, is the true tipping point. Empires fall not when they run out of money, but when they run out of belief. The United States stands at a moment where multiple trajectories converge. Overwhelming debt, monetary weakening, military overreach, political polarization, social fragmentation, economic inequality, and declining global trust. Each of these factors alone is manageable. Together they form the same collapse signature that ended Spain's golden age, dismantled Britain's global dominance, and shattered the Soviet Union. And although Americans may insist that their system is different, that innovation, creativity, and democratic values will save them, every empire believed it had something unique that would preserve its power. Spain believed silver made it untouchable. Britain believed its navy guaranteed eternal supremacy. The Soviet Union believed ideology would keep its republics united. Empires always convince themselves that history bends around them. It never does. The truth is harsh but simple. America is not approaching the collapse cycle. It is in it, deep in it, past the early warning signs, past the reversible stages, past the point where minor reforms can shift the outcome. Mathematically, structurally, economically, and socially, the momentum has already built. The remaining question is not whether the United States will face a dramatic correction, but when and how fast. It could take 10 years. It could take 5. It could take less. The timing is uncertain, but the trajectory is not. And when the collapse finally becomes undeniable, when the events unfold rapidly and the consequences spread through every aspect of American life, the reaction will be the same as it was in Spain, Britain, and the Soviet Union. People will say the same sentence humanity has repeated in every empire that believed itself eternal. We never thought it could happen here. They will say it with disbelief, with confusion, with regret, and with the realization that the cycle did not spare them simply because they were American. The cycle has never spared anyone.